There we go. All right, so yeah, as I said, this is Public and Nonprofit Administration Capstone, and they're looking at the Kalamazoo River this semester and all of the various issues that, are associated with that, whether, obviously the environmental piece is a big piece, but also, economic development, tourism, there's a lot that relates back to the river, and they've got pretty free reign in how they develop this project and their recommendations. But we definitely wanted to get a perspective from the cities, from the city about what issues the city addresses and a bit more about the complexity, because obviously there are federal agencies, state agencies, nonprofit agencies, all with their hands in this. I will say that Tuesday we actually we were able to get 2 of them out and took them down the river, so they got to see like the landfills and the train yards and everything that's along the river firsthand, and get a little better, just a different view of it other than maps and what have you. So, but with that, I'll just turn it over to you and let you get us started.
I'll do my best. If I go off topic or you want to hear something else, just let me know.
Sure.
Going back, obviously rivers were very important, and the paper mills came in, and that was a very good livelihood for many people. So they built around the river. There's been a lot of changes to the river because when they built the paper mills, they put in dams, they built channels, they called them mill races. And so there's a lot of those that still exist, and a lot of them that have been filled in, and so it's been altered for, well over 150 years in one way or another. And of course, the paper mills let us have the legacy of contamination. And so I worked down near Patterson and Riverview, right alongside the river at the wastewater treatment facility. We have an administration building that I'm in, and we are on the Kalamazoo River in a section
we actually went past it.
Okay, well, they are, and the EPA is still dredging the river from some PCPs from the past, and so they'll be doing that probably through 2025. And I think that will complete most of their dredging for the PCBs that flow down the river from the paper mills. So that's one issue. We had more recently the Morrow Lake Dam that had some structural issues, and they ended up having to lower the lake level for safety reasons, and that caused a tremendous amount of sediment to get pushed down the river and kind of clog some of the areas and habitats and things like that. So that is something that was a key issue in the last couple of years. And as the environmental programs manager, I am in charge of the compliance for rainwater that runs off and discharges to our storm system, which eventually discharges to a creek or the Kalamazoo River, and the water quality associated with that. So we monitor for any releases that get to the river or potentially could get to the river. And we make sure that we stop the releases and hold the appropriate party responsible. So when the pipings that is in the ground underneath the streets, they kind of combine and eventually go towards the creek and discharge to the creek. Those are our outfalls, we call them. And so we have like 341, I think, outfalls. That's a tremendous amount that discharge into the creeks, Arcadia, Axtell Creek, and the Kalamazoo River, and even Davis Creek or Olmsted Drain, that might be known as. So quite a bit of stormwater to deal with. It's somewhat overwhelming. Let's see. We also have well fields where our city, we supply water, drinking water to almost 200,000 people now in the Kalamazoo County area, and moving further out from the city to help other communities get water supplies. So keeping the water sources is really important, and we get our drinking water from the ground, so we're 100% groundwater supplied. But there's a great interaction between surface water and groundwater, and we take advantage of that. Where our well fields are located is usually near some type of surface water feature or creek, and that helps always maintain the recharge into the groundwater from the surface water body. That makes sense. So it's important for us that the quality of surface water is protected, as well as the groundwater. So that's the majority of what my job is. I come from environmental consulting, which is a lot of remediation, cleaning up sites, brownfields, and so forth. And so that's kind of my take, and why, I have this position. My whole background is making sure we prevent contamination, which is a lot cheaper, as opposed to cleaning up, which is very, very expensive and very hard to do. So if you were on the Kalamazoo River, you passed all the industrial areas, the Norfolk Botsford Yard rail station that exists is very, very old. As you know, railroads were some of the first forms of transportation, and they've been bringing in all kinds of materials for decades.
And we've been learning a lot about the stuff that's being carried on trains, just
Yes.
not only in the last 2 weeks, but with today's derailment out in Wayne County. So.
Oh, well, I hadn't heard of that one yet.
Yep, that was this morning.
Okay, well, I'll look into that one. Fortunately, we haven't had the disaster that they had recently, so we've had some derailments, but nothing that was, to my knowledge, that was significant in terms of chemical releases. But if you are along the Kalamazoo River, because river water was so valuable back then, before they had a lot of drinking water supplies and manufacturers needed water, they would go to the river, they would build around the river. And so your oldest industrial areas are bordering parts of the river in the inner city. So, I mean, it just kind of makes sense, right? But as you don't realize it necessarily when they get redeveloped, you see some beautiful building and you don't realize that it's had a whole history of various manufacturing and this and that.
We found a map from, I want to say 1967 on the U.S. Geological Survey's website. And it's amazing the number of waste and sewage disposal sites that existed back then along the river.
Yeah. Well,
it was like every next dot was one or the other, and right across from schools and playgrounds and things like that.
Yeah, I understand. We can't change it, but we can do better. And
Right.
We definitely do have much better practices, and just technology has increased tremendously. So that's having that new technology and better understanding. We've corrected a lot of things. So Kalamazoo River obviously has PCBs, which is from the former paper mills, and it is in the sediment in the bottom of the river. So basically the river's been usable for quite some time in terms of, you can canoe in it, you can get in it, you could swim in it. It's not my preferred choice, but it's been, it's usable, even though it's had contamination in it. It's just that contamination is down deep, and unless you went way down to the bottom and, pulled up sediments for whatever reason, you really won't have an exposure. But what they're doing right now in dredging is they're getting out areas of the river that they've defined as being extremely concentrated in PCBs. And so they feel that it's, it's not a full river cleanup, but it's getting some of the worst stuff out.
So the current area where they've been doing the dredging, if I recall, they're supposed to be done, and like Verberg Park is supposed to reopen in the spring. But you said, is it the next stretch up that the next round of dredging will be through 2025, or?
Yeah, they'll keep moving north.
Okay.
up through into Parchment.
Mhm.
I can't tell you the exact the end of it, but I just actually was mapping it today for another purpose. So as part of the compliance with stormwater runoff, which eventually goes to a creek, which eventually goes to the Kalamazoo River, we have what we call a National Pollution Elimination Discharge System, NPDES. It's a big, huge permit that we get with the state. And it says all the things that we can do to prevent pollution. And so a large part of what we do is education. And so we have this website that the city maintains strictly for public education on all things water. So drinking water supplies, stormwater, our permit for discharging to the creek and the river, all that information, because the best thing we can do is teach people what not to do and how to do things better. Kind of
You mean we're not
awareness thing.
supposed to dump our old motor oil down a storm drain?
Please don't. I don't want to
I'm
have
curious.
to come and investigate and
Right.
Yeah.
give you a notice of violation. But it's an overwhelming task, and stormwater is an unfunded utility. So there's, unlike your drinking water supplies or your sanitary sewer, you pay for what you use. Nobody pays for the stormwater pipes and drains and outfalls. So,
As far as runoff goes, with all of these different facilities along the river, are there general, I guess, mitigation efforts going into like corralling that runoff from like the metal recycling plant next to growlers, or there's that chemical manufacturing plant down towards Parchment, Hercules, I believe. I mean, they're just great sources of pollution, and they just don't seem to have any mitigation to it.
well, you'd be surprised. Of course, utilities are generally underground. People don't know what is always underground. Those industrial and manufacturing type companies who have any type of discharge runoff to a storm system or to the creeks or river, they have what you call an industrial permit, and that's through the state of Michigan, and the state is the enforcer on that. And so I know they do go around and enforce and inspect those companies to make sure that they annually inspect their stormwater structures so that they can function properly. And if they're clogged with sediment or something, they need repair, or they're damaged or broken, cracked, whatever it is, they are responsible for fixing it. That way their storm systems work. And embedded in a lot of those systems are a lot of traps that you don't see. They're in the ground under these manholes, and they collect sediment on purpose. So that's why they need to be maintained and cleaned out periodically. And the runoff, what we try to improve is not having it go to the creek and having it infiltrate into the ground. So you might see alongside the roads, the ditches that intentionally are there to collect the water. A lot of it seeps right into the ground, so it doesn't all go to the creek or to the storm sewer system, which is piping. We have some very large basins. We call them retention or detention basins, meaning they hold the water, and they are designed to hold like a large storm to a certain capacity, and then they slowly release it to the ground if possible. And if they can't, they slowly release it to the storm sewers, which release eventually to the creek or to the river. Does that make sense?
No.
So there's a lot of things in the ground that you don't necessarily see. We call them treatment structured. And the other ones are more natural. We take advantage of like rain gardens, or what they call swales, which is really kind of a ditch. But the hard part about those is they're biological. So if they're not maintained, you'll find some of them overgrown with trees and so forth, and they actually don't function after a long period of neglect. And that's usually what happens. People keep up with them. Oh, pretty rain garden for a few years, and then, oh, stop taking care of it. Next thing, it looks kind of like an ugly eyesore that's not functioning properly. So it does take maintenance, and that's also a part of my job, is to make sure that when these systems are installed, we require that they be inspected annually, and if they need to be cleaned out or repaired, that they do that regularly. And then they submit that to the city to as part of using our storm sewer system.
Mhm.
That makes sense. So whenever someone comes in and they want to rebuild a property, take down a building, or add an addition, or even just change their parking lot, they go through a process through the city. It's called the site plan review. And there's a representative from pretty much every department there who helps them out and says, well, these are the things that you're going to have to do. These are the requirements, whether it's a building code, streets, is it connection to sanitary sewer, and my part is one, the compliance with storm, and what are they going to do with all that water that they maintain when it rains or storms. And the other part is any environmental contamination associated with the site. How are we going to rebuild it safely and get rid of any type of risk involved?
So, something else that's a bit related is that I know that there are certain areas of town, and of course they typically are, in the lower income areas, that have a tendency to flood. And, especially, in spring, when not so much this year, there's not a lot of snow melt, but whenever heavy rains come through, there are certain vulnerable areas. Could you just speak to that in general? Because I'm sure that there's a question I should be asking, but I don't know what the right question is.
That's all right. I think I know where you're going. Well, one, think of the earth. It holds a lot of water, a lot of storage water. That's why we can pump wells and produce your drinking water supply, and we can pump a lot of water out of the ground. We're naturally in an area that has extremely good aquifers. So aquifers are the sands and gravels that are below us that hold all that water in between the particles. So think of it like a storage tank. So nature has a way of having cycles. They may have, a 10,000-year cycle, a 1,000-year cycle, 100-year cycle. Sometimes there's short cycles, like, every 5 years. So I've been measuring water levels in the ground for a long time, all around the state of Michigan in my work. And I can tell you that the late 90s, we had less rain and less rain. So the water levels go down and down. So the tank, think of the earth as a tank of water, at least in this area, it went down. And so flooding wasn't very prevalent. Through the early 2000s, the water levels increased more and more. And eventually you get into like 2018, where the tank is full, but there hadn't been much flooding. But once the tank is full, its capacity to take on more is very reduced. So if you may have the same amount of rain from one year to year, but if the tank gets fuller and fuller each year, eventually you're going to have flooding. And that's what we had in 2018. It was a very bad flooding year.
Right.
Right. And so the tank is still pretty full, but it's lowered in the last couple of years. And, these are just natural cycles that we'll see. And, we've measured them, the last 100 and some years. So we know that this is a natural phenomenon. However, there is flooding in areas that are not in flood zones.
Right.
And you probably would be talking about maybe the north side of Kalamazoo, the older areas. And that is because they are the older areas. So when they built, they were residential areas and small residential parcels. And we didn't have a lot of pavement. We didn't have a lot of large roads. So water could infiltrate. And
the concrete jungles and the lack of greenscaping in a lot of those areas also contributes as well.
Exactly. So it might seem like it's just more rain or snow melt, but a lot of it is just that it can't infiltrate like it used to because we've paved so much. So the infrastructures put in, 100 plus years ago are still in the ground in some cases. And they were sized for not having a lot of flow. So now we have a need to have more flow because it can't infiltrate and the pipes are undersized. So that is part of the cause of, it's not really called flooding because they're not in a floodplain per se. I'm trying to think of the word that we use. I don't use it a lot because people don't know it. But anyway, it's surcharge. That's what it is. So unfortunately, some of it is just due to the very old structures that are in the ground, which we would love to replace. But as I said, the stormwater utility is not funded.
And this is a slight tangent, but something I didn't know until maybe a year or two ago is that apparently the city used to have wooden gas lines.
They used to hollow out trees and we had water lines made out of wood, and we do have some still in the ground that we find every once in a while. So they did what they could back then. It was pretty amazing. So any questions? I mean, I'm throwing out a lot. I don't know if you already know all this. I don't know if you're familiar with it.
No, most of this has been new, especially with the stormwater and groundwater issues. We hadn't even gotten to that yet. So this is perfect timing.
Okay.
Yeah, what else would we like to know? Well, I mean, we do have a couple of questions related to like some planned developments along the river and just what the general plans are.
Yeah. I heard that there's some I guess like low-income residential structures going in. Would that be to the west of Gearhart train yard, where the the
down on Mill Street?
Yeah,
Mills, and is that East Michigan?
Mills in East Michigan, over like in Ampersand, like where the encampment was a couple of years ago, that area.
Well, the city is working as hard as they can to put in more affordable housing. And they're trying to make the process for people to build easier, especially if you're at a lower income. So they have sites that they think can be developed. And again, a lot of things had to change because homes used to have extremely small lots. So even with our, building codes and safety codes, and there's a lot of codes, houses can't be built on these little lots really very effectively. And most people don't want that anyway. So they've restructured parcel descriptions and how they can make it easier to build on the parcels that are around here, combining them and readdressing them and things like that. So that's where, it starts out with. And the other part is making the process simple. So they have kind of a short list of designs that are relatively inexpensive, that are, they're trying a lot of new designs for energy efficiency and so forth, but keeping the footprint low, but enough so that you could have a nice, affordable, either apartment or some of them are little mini homes. They're kind of cute and they kind of share a drive and sort of don't take a lot of land.
I've seen those on that West Main area, and those are pretty nice little spots.
Yeah, and so they fit them in these odd little lots, and people are using them and buying them. So then they have other designs that are bigger. Maybe there'll be 2 apartments in one structure. Some are 4. Some have upper levels and lower, but they're doing their best. It's just very expensive to build right now. So building an affordable house right now, I don't know if you've been on the market for a house.
Yeah, they don't really exist.
Yeah, it gets complicated, right?
Yeah, for sure.
But all of those go through our site plan review process again, like every department in the city has a representative, the fire department, myself, environmental, stormwater, water, supply, sanitary, there's building codes and lot codes and zoning codes, and they go through the process. We try to make it as simple as possible and tell them what they're facing if they want to do this or that.
Okay, so is there kind of an effort by the city to develop some of the area around the river? Maybe for
Absolutely. The area of Riverview and Gull Street.
Mhm.
Okay,
Right.
yeah.
In the process redone. You've seen some of the circles like on Harrison Street that have been put in. There's some new housing apartment complexes down there. That whole area, they're slowly working on trying to take advantage of, the space and try to put in walking trails and places for people, to have to go outdoors. So
Right.
better planning is a big part of it.
So, yeah, what groups would be, are involved with that entire development effort? Like, both, obviously, I'm thinking within the city government, but there's definitely going to be external factors there as well.
Yeah, well, internally, we are community, CPAD, community planning and economic development. They're kind of the leaders. They also do brownfield redevelopments. So that is something that they work with the state on. There's also like HUD and some of these MISHDA type organizations. I forget if they're federal or state. I don't work with them much. But they all combine are working on getting as much grant money or economic development assistance as possible.
Mhm.
It's a pretty big thing.
I assume that Southwest Michigan First is also a part of that effort, like, in attracting business and what have you.
I would imagine so. Like I said, that's not really something I'm
Right.
in. But going back to the river, you said you were going to have Doug McLaughlin come in?
Yeah, we had him last week.
Okay. So that group, the Watershed Council was, I think, first established when the stormwater permittees, like the city of Kalamazoo, the city of Portage, the road commission, the drain commissioner, those entities had to get permits through the state to discharge into the creeks and rivers. It was done on sort of a watershed basis. So all of these governments communicated through what was the Watershed Council. Then later on, the permits changed and they became individual permits. So the focus was kind of taken away from the watershed. Now, because we are being held accountable for what gets to the creek and public education, which is really difficult for a lot of these communities. They don't have staff, they have no money. We've joined efforts, gotten a couple of small grants, and we host a page on behalf of all the MS4 agencies in stormwater education. And it's quite successful. We market it so that it goes out and actually reaches people, and we target the people that we think would be the ones to educate: children, families, people in the areas that we are in, and so forth. So that's been a huge success. So we're kind of becoming a little bit more back to the watershed focus, because we found in some ways we can work collectively better than apart. And that all of it is due to staff and lack of financing for everyone. So it's quite a challenge, truly, to meet the
So it
goals.
sounds like the entire, like the Watershed Council sort of being that point for, collaborating with all the different smaller local government entities that, like you're saying, don't have the staff.
Well, they're not quite the point, but they are involved, and we rely on them for some of our permit compliance requirements. So one would be how much phosphorus gets to the Kalamazoo River.
Mhm.
That is what they call the TMDL, total maximum daily load of phosphorus. And they do head that up, but not a lot of the other components. We're working with the state to try to let us work collectively a little bit better. It's a struggle.
Mhm.
That, we're the city of Kalamazoo is, out of all the governments in Kalamazoo County, it's really got the oldest infrastructure, the highest density, and so forth. And so we have quite the challenge. Whereas if you're out, say, like Portage, they've got a lot more land. They can infiltrate, they can put in big basins, they can focus on the infiltration because they can put in a big basin. Well, in the city, you'll be hard pressed to find a property big enough that we could dedicate it just to infiltrating stormwater runoff, if that makes sense. So our focus is pipes and pipes that go to pipes. When there is a release of some chemical, at one point in the county, it travels possibly through one jurisdiction's pipes into the next jurisdictions. So, for example, I don't know if you know where Spring Valley Lake is at all, up on, it's over by Borges.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
with that park, I believe.
So there's a small road on the side of Borges Hospital, and there's an outfall because there's this big Spring Valley Lake behind it. It's an impounded kind of creek, but it's a beautiful lake. I encourage everyone to go there, nice walking trails, and it's one of our well fields. We found that there was something discharging to the lake. So to find out what it is discharging through all the piping, we found out that, well, the city owned that point at which it actually entered the lake. But if you went out the piping structure to the next manhole, that was owned by the road commission. Then as you get to Gull Road, that is owned by MDOT.
Oh, good times.
Yeah.
And so, I can't just go in other people's piping runs and do what I want, right? So it's a lot of coordination, and it's difficult to shut down like a road like Gull Road just to open up a manhole to see what's going down the drain. So it takes a lot of cooperation in between agencies.
Yeah, I'd imagine so. Yeah, and that's the thing is when you cross jurisdictional boundaries, there's a lot of, not just turf wars, but then also, turf wars when they want credit for things, but playing hot potato when they don't want the blame. So
Indeed.
I don't really have too much problem. Most people are as cooperative as they can be. But again, in these older infrastructures, we don't have diagrams of what that pipe looked like and where it came from. And so we do find periodically new structures in the ground that we didn't know exist. So.
And there are also, budget challenges, I'm sure. Like if any of you guys have the Recycle Coach app, it's almost daily this time of year that you're going to see that there's another water main break. But which, yeah, the city has to handle that. But yeah, most of those are super old and need replaced, but the funding isn't there. Because there are, especially, in Michigan, there are limitations on how much property tax rates can fluctuate from year to year, as well as just, the political will. Like, yeah, maybe we could try and get a bond issue or pass a special local option sales tax to cover water main repairs, but the political will to see that happen. I mean, not many people like to vote for their taxes to go up.
No, that is very true. And it's also, how many taxable properties do you have? how many are on the tax roll.
Right.
The older areas, you're gonna have less, and the newer areas, you're gonna have more. So there's
Right.
a difference there. But no, it's a challenge. The water main breaks. Yeah, it's the old piping. The pipes that were put in the ground, whether it's stormwater or drinking water or sanitary, you know, they used the materials that they had at the time, and some of them lasted and some did not. Some broke easy and some did not. Some had lead in, some do not. And we're, you know, always working and trying to get rid of that. But it's amazing, you know, if you go back and think, how would you build the infrastructure without, you know, being able to go by piping at, you know, Menards or wherever they did what they had to. So sometimes there's some pretty bizarre structures. They work, but they can be, you look at them and you say, wow, how did they make that work?
Yes.
Like you were talking about the wood pipes.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah. Well, how about from the rest of you students? Do you have questions? Thoughts?
I would like to ask, do you feel like a lot of like citizens of Kalamazoo have some understanding of this, or is it like, you know, we've been talking about as a class, like doing some kind of like awareness campaign, but then I've also, especially after being on the river, am kind of thinking more like there's almost like this very like negative perception of the river, and I feel like I'm kind of trying to go between like awareness of the like pollution and the issues surrounding it, or awareness of that it's also still a really cool river. So
Yeah.
So
And
yeah,
you can
just a
use
little
it.
bit about like where kind of the community is with the river.
Well, that's where the Kalamazoo River Watershed Council, they've been doing a lot of promotional things and bringing people to the river. They do give out a lot of information. Ourselves, we also provide information to give out at these events. Canoe the Kazoo
Mhm.
is one. One is trash pickup, although I would not advise that just due to some of the trash. It wouldn't be appropriate for all people to pick up right now in some of these areas.
Yeah, we saw some of the, you know, some of the former encampments and the trash along
Yeah.
that. So yeah, and there are a lot of things like, you know, needles and stuff that unless you've been trained to deal with hazardous stuff, you really don't want to risk yourself out there.
Right. And so I wouldn't encourage that right now. Years ago, I would have said fine, but I don't think that's right to do without having proper protection and that you know what you're doing. But yeah, they do try to bring in a lot of awareness. We focus, because of our compliance with the storm sewer system, we focus mostly on reducing things getting into the streets. We do a lot of street sweeping. We're big on teaching people not to dump things down the drain. Where does it go? How are things related? We put a ton into all water resources, especially because a large portion of the city's area is where we collect our groundwater from. So we do protect that and restrict chemical usage and land use in those areas, which is a pretty good size of Kalamazoo. So we do monitor a lot of that. But yeah, the MS4 group is just, I think they're kind of a small, tight niche group, but they don't get much exposure. And that's why we worked to get the protectyourwater.net webpage. It's called KSWG for the Kalamazoo Stormwater Working Group. And we rotate out new content every month, and it's all stormwater related. Has high quality, you know, pictures, posters, slideshows, and a lot of links. And so that's really the one thing we can do to reach out to people. And when we market that, and you'll see them on your cell phone or this or that, depending on if you're our target zone or not. But it's quite successful. We have Facebook that is markets the same thing. We have radio ads, we have movie ads, and we have online TV ads. And those are all grant funded either through the Wellhead Protection Program or the Stormwater Program. So yeah,
I'm guessing those are federal programs that are funding
Nope.
that?
they're state.
State, okay.
Okay. Both through the EAGLE, they call them,
Mhm.
Environment, Great Lakes, and Energy.
Right. Yep. Which
So,
we've got, we're gonna talk to, I think our next on Tuesday is a chat with someone from DNR, and then we do have someone from Eagle joining us, so.
Oh, good.
Yeah, we're trying to really get a lot of different perspectives, because like I said, it is a complicated issue.
It is. There's the concept of a stormwater utility, such as somehow it would be funded, but how would you fund it? So the hard part about stormwater is that it rains everywhere. It's not like in one neighborhood, or you sign up to get water, or you can put your own well in. And then, how do you decide who pays what? Because it's not by usage, it's not by per gallon. You don't even know how much runoff you have, right?
Right.
But if you're, within the city boundaries, it runs off eventually to somewhere that gets to either a storm sewer system, a ditch, a creek, or some avenue. It gets to the Kalamazoo River. That's the fate of it. So their ideas like, well, how much pervious versus impervious ground do you have on your property? Was it 50%? Is it 2 acres? Is it 5 acres? And then would you charge people that have more, pavement or more land, the land is covered and impervious than the next door neighbor who has a lot of, impervious area? What about farm fields? When you own 1,000 acres, do you pay, or maybe they just keep the water on site? I don't know. But there's just a lot of issues that it's easy to contest and say it's not fair, so to speak.
Yeah, I can see a lot of potential equity issues arising out of that as well, especially when you consider that, for a lot of folks, that's not even something you consider when you choose where you live.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, what we're finding out is in Michigan, the average charge for those communities that do have some type of stormwater utility program, they charge, I'm just going to say on the high end, is about $5 a month. So, to some people that's a lot, and some people wouldn't think twice about it.
Right. Yeah. What else would you guys like to know?
When does the class get over? No.
Technically 4:45, but we'll let's see. What about Brian? You got anything else?
I guess let's see, do you cover the drinking water by chance?
I do from, I'm a geologist, so in terms of protection of the areas where we pull the water out, our well fields, called. We have right now, I think 92 or 93 wells that are within the city or outside of the city in different well fields. If you've been to El Sabo, out in Texas Township, that's a well field. There's McLinden Trails out in Comstock, that's a well field. So we have, the city started out in the center by the Kalamazoo River, putting in a few wells. Turned out to be an excellent spot. We're still, the primary well field is down by Crosstown and Stockbridge area.
Mhm.
And we have several wells in that area. And that is a really important area for us because it's one in an area where the potential to be contaminated is great because there's a lot of people around it. Then we have, as the communities grew and moved outside of the city boundaries, and you have these suburbs and smaller communities growing, further away from the central area, we've put well fields out further to adjust for elevation differences. So the Kalamazoo River being the lowest point, and then if you go out to like Oshtemo and Texas Township, where the elevation is much higher due to the geologic materials that we call them the moraines, the hills, we put well fields out that way. But very uniquely, our well fields can connect to each other, so we can move water around the city quite well. If there's a need in one community versus another, if there's a major fire that needs more water, we can move water around fairly well. It's a quite unique system, actually. Kind of hard to absorb how much, and water has to be pumped uphill and has to be released to go downhill to do that. But we have a lot of what they call booster and bleeder pumps that make that difference between elevation possible to pump water.
And you touched on that the wellheads there at Crosstown. I guess, what are the hazards, especially associated with the Allied Paper Mill Superfund site?
I do work on that. Right now, there is no known connection, but it is in one of the restricted areas, so that is a big concern of ours. As they're doing their cleanup, I don't think people focused on the potential interaction between the Allied site and the well field. However, PCBs are not known to go into water. They're not like water loving compounds. So that is less of a concern. If it's something that is a water loving compound, like some of the dry cleaning compounds and things like that, that dissolve in water easily, those are more dangerous. However, it is a landfill and there are other things there too. But I know the city in the past did really try to get the remediation to include ways to monitor the groundwater so that it would not affect the well fields. But I don't think that was ever properly addressed from what I'm finding. So that is one of my objectives. So a lot of things, you can't do them all at once, that's for sure.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's a long laundry list.
Yeah, I don't know if you've been by that site, and as you know, Portage Creek goes right through that cleanup area, so that is a concern.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I've got experience of working in landfills, and a friend of mine was working on site.
Oh yeah.
Just kind of became a concern when I found out there wasn't a liner or really capped very properly, and it was just like, oh man.
Well, yeah.
I know.
Not much you can say about that. It's like, well, yeah,
It's the percolator.
we're not the ones who did it. We're just the ones who are stuck with it now.
Yeah.
Well, we'll see what happens. Everything is still in progress, and nothing has been determined completely, except that they are consolidating, I should say, all that landfill material in one big area.
Right.
It's not real beautiful looking if you've driven by.
No, but it's nice that it's finally getting cleaned up and addressed. This has definitely been a long problem.
Yeah, they're a few years out yet until they finish, and then putting it back to vegetated areas and things like that will take some while. But yeah, there's not much left that you would recognize from a few years ago, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Mhm. Right.
Now, are there plans to develop that property after the fact, maybe turn it into a park or something?
That has not been determined. It won't be like manufacturing or anything like that, because you really just can't do that.
Right.
That makes sense. Somebody else would be buying that problem.
Yeah.
So a lot of these decisions haven't been formulated completely yet.
Gotcha.
Hmm.
Gotcha.
So yeah, but yeah, from all of these paper mills, this is where this PCB came from, and other chemicals as well. But my mother tells me when she was a kid, the Kalamazoo River was white.
Yes.
Yeah.
water.
We've
So-
seen some of the pictures.
So everything's relative, right? To her,
Mm-hmm.
the river is clean. To some of us, we'd be like, oh, it's, it's not clean, it's contaminated. I think it really comes down to risk. And that's what most people don't think about. Just because something is there doesn't mean it's posing a risk.
Mhm.
So, like I said, you can canoe in it and you can swim in it. Not my preference, but that it's
Right.
usable and it's beautiful.
Mhm. Yeah, we saw some folks doing, catch and release. What was that, yesterday or was that Sunday?
Yeah.
Yeah, or Tuesday. Yeah. They'll still go fishing. They knew that they couldn't eat the fish safely, but they still, they enjoy it for that as well.
People do eat the fish, but they have limits.
You're
They
right.
at least propose limits. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Generally, I just wouldn't eat the fish. So I just wouldn't. But then I don't eat fish much anyway. So and apologies for Bagel just completely bageling back there, even though he's locked in the just take away the food bowl. So yeah, students, what else do you guys want to know?
do I like my job? How's
Yeah,
that?
that's a good, tell.
I was wondering like how you got to be doing this job. Like what was your career setup like to get where you are now?
Well, I'm a geologist, so I actually was getting my master's at Western, and I had to pay for my college. So I said, anybody know where I can get a job? And I got an internship here at the city, working on some of the contaminated well fields. And then that led me to getting a job with the state of Michigan. And I worked and traveled around the state for, we were sort of like an investigative unit with a drill rig and lab equipment. And we would go around and sample areas where there was a high degree of cancer, leukemia, deformities, and things like that. And we would test the water and find out, what the problem was and where it was coming from. And all that information would go to the Attorney General's office to then enforce whoever was responsible to clean it up. So I did that for a decade. And then my husband and I had 4 kids, and it was harder and harder to travel. I went into consulting and did cleanups all around Southwest Michigan. A big part of my job with the state also was to respond to emergency releases back before we had hazmat teams and things like that. So got a lot of background in that. Had a lot of different jobs in consulting that I really have enjoyed. Cleaning up, it can take decades, but it's doing something good. I like being outdoors. I found that the job had a lot of variety to it. I am a scientist, and I like the sampling. I like evaluating. I like investigating, finding out, how did things happen? How are we going to clean them up, and so forth. And there's just a lot of, the scientist in me enjoys doing that. It's something like if you have a good 3-dimensional mind, that helps a lot, because if you don't, it's very hard to deal with. I call it the patient. The earth is a pretty large patient.
Mhm.
So a doctor can probe you, put you through a machine, you take your blood and everything else. But when you've got, a patient that's, 16 acres and you put a couple of wells in the ground, you don't have a lot of data. So, and you better hope you put that well in the right spot, because it costs a lot to do so.
Yes.
Lab samples and so forth. So I did that for a number of years. I was in 2018 looking to switch jobs. I altered my jobs for my family, and I've worked from my home a lot on many jobs and enjoyed doing that. So I was looking for a change. A friend of mine said, "Hey, have you thought about working for the city of Kalamazoo?" And I said, "No." And they were persistent, so I ended up interviewing, and I decided to take it. I felt like it was something worthwhile, something different, but clearly all my background kind of collectively works well with this job.
Right.
So I do enjoy it.
Awesome. Yeah, so
Consulting pays better.
she's a great example of what we call sector switchers who, sometimes you're working for public, like right now you're working for a public organization, but you can take that expertise to nonprofits, to private business. But we see a lot of that.
Yeah. I mean, I taught at KVCC for a while in their earth sciences. I love doing that. But it just didn't pay worth anything.
No, it does not, especially part-time teaching.
Right. But I really did enjoy it. But my supervisor said, all the students you're teaching will have like 7 different careers in their lifetime, like not just switching the type of job or, going from one company to another, but actually different careers. And I thought that was pretty interesting.
Yeah.
Perspective. So a lot more opportunities out there, that's for sure. We in the city are looking always to bring in new talent. And I know the perception of working for a utility is sort of like, well, who would do that? They're all like grunts or something and working on the road. But all the people here have engineering degrees. They're professionals with excellent backgrounds in education. You'd be surprised at it is not the perception that most people have. Like most people would say, "Oh, I never worked there," but they have no real idea. But the scientists, our lab is really a wonderful lab. We have lab techs come in, that leads to other jobs. We have just a variety of professional jobs here and careers, and the pay is maybe not as good as, say, in consulting, but the city has a pension and they have a lot of other good benefits. So it's really very nice opportunity that you wouldn't imagine. Even working for wastewater, you'd say, "Oh, who would work there?" But there are some really excellent, almost genius type people here that do phenomenal things to make this plant work. It's so complicated, and the chemistry and the mechanicals and the computers, and just it's amazing. So
It's a neat place.
yeah, it really is. And we give tours, and everyone thinks, "Oh, tours of the wastewater treatment plant," but when they see the size of this facility, you see the size of the pumps that they use, you see it's just much different. You realize that this isn't just some simple, couple buildings that comes in, it goes out kind of thing. It takes a tremendous amount to balance cleaning sewage up and having it go out to the river cleaner than the river. So literally they show you what they discharge to the river, and it's clear, and it's doesn't have an odor, and they put a jar next to the Kalamazoo River water, and you're like, "Oh, who drink that?" Not that we drink anything from the wastewater plant; it all goes to the river. But want to separate that. The drinking water supply has nothing to do with the wastewater supply.
Other questions? I think, Stephen, I saw you maybe unmute yourself earlier, like you were going to ask something or.
Yeah, I'm always the what's the good news guy. So I was just gonna ask you
Yes, you are.
what's the good news from? I know you've kind of covered some good stuff, but if you could put it into like a 2-minute spiel of like what's the good news, I'd love to hear your perspective on that.
What's the good news on
Yeah.
stormwater?
I would just say like that, and then like the Kalamazoo River just in general, like however you kind of want to run with it.
I think it's all good news. There's so many great people here that are really talented and developing better ways of doing things, that are bringing in new equipment, new ideas, and everybody is always working to make improvements. There's so much going on. I almost can't even like formulate it all in my head. And I just work for one part of it. But great new ideas, rethinking things, challenging ourselves. You know, how could we get rid of flooding? How could we have a water supply for drinking that's more stable? Like there's not much variability. How do we remove iron? How do we getting funding to do these things to make the quality of life better? Is really important to all of us, and it is a challenge, and people work diligently at it. I love the people here because they're here for a reason, or otherwise they wouldn't be here. They'd be out, possibly making much more money elsewhere. But it's a really nice place to be. So that's the good news. And if you ever want a tour of the wastewater treatment plant or our drinking water treatment plant, we have those available anytime. Let us know and we can provide any of that.
Yeah.
That's my, education piece there. I had to throw in, right? And the other one is go to protectyourwater.net and check out our resources.
Yeah. Any other questions, folks, since we're almost out of time? No?
I
Okay.
encourage the tour. It's pretty awesome.
I haven't, oh, you've done it before.
Yes.
Okay, I have not, but I
It's
mean,
been about 10 years,
well,
15, but
I
yeah.
did one back in Alabama years ago. So yeah, but bad idea.
We have a pretty state-of-the-art wastewater treatment system because of the what started out as the Upjohn Company and taking a lot of their pharmaceuticals. So a lot of the processes here were upgraded to the highest standards, and so we still receive from other manufacturers as well as the pharmaceutical their waste, and so we have high standards.
Awesome. It's good to know.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your time. We really appreciate this, and it's been really useful to get perspective from at different levels, especially with the city and how they approach the water issues in the river. So.
Yeah, we're always working to do things better, and in my opinion, the river is getting better constantly. I really think that the past is the past, and we have to realize that you can use that river without having a risk to yourself. We can't get rid of all the things from the past that happened, but we can reduce the risk associated so that we can have a better quality of life standard.
Yeah. And make sure that it's not allowed to ever happen again.
Right. And now we've learned those lessons, right?
Yes, we have. Great. Well, have a great rest of your afternoon. We really appreciate you. And
happy to share. I hope I was able to give you some new material to learn, and
yeah,
feel free to contact me if you have another question or something.
Absolutely. So great.
And come and visit and take a tour.
Yeah, I might be doing that. We'll see which of the others want to join me. That might be another field trip day. So,
okay.
Yeah. Great. Well, for the rest of you, I will see you again back here at this same little Zoom channel on Tuesday. And I hope that everyone has an awesome weekend. So,
Take care and thank you for inviting me. Appreciate
all
it.
right.
Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.